The wind howled through the frozen wilderness, threatening to swallow everything in its path. But within the walls of his cabin, a man stood unfazed. Unseen ingenuity would soon prove to be his salvation in a storm like no other. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this inspire you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode will be even more unbelievable than this one. When he first started stacking the logs, they laughed. How could they not? A second wall around a cabin? In the midst of this harsh wilderness? Who would even think of such a thing, let alone waste precious time and resources on it? The neighbors called it madness. "You'll freeze out there no matter what you build," they would say, their voices tinged with the bitterness of their own hardships. The winters here were unforgiving. Even the toughest men couldn't withstand the relentless chill for long without succumbing to the cold. Yet, Samuel had his mind set on something else, something beyond simple survival. He knew the weather here well. The mountain air could freeze a man's bones within minutes, and the wind could tear through even the thickest layers of clothing. No cabin, no matter how well constructed, was safe from nature's wrath. And yet, there he was, meticulously stacking log after log around the perimeter of his cabin, building a second wall of protection. Most of the men around here were concerned with getting by. But Samuel wasn't just looking to survive. He was looking to outlast the elements, to build something that would make him invulnerable in a place that took pride in making men bow to its will. For a week, the mockery continued. Men who passed by his cabin couldn't help but chuckle. What a fool! What was he really trying to prove? They didn't understand that Samuel wasn't trying to prove anything to them. He was doing it for himself, for that one deep-seated feeling he had that if he didn't, something far worse than cold might find him. Something that couldn't be killed with a rifle or fought off with bare hands. The logs were heavy, but Samuel moved them with a determination that spoke volumes about the quiet obsession consuming him. The second wall wasn't just a physical structure, it was his answer to a world that had already taken too much. He didn't know it yet, but the wall he was building would soon save his life in ways he couldn't imagine. The first snap of winter came early that year. By the middle of November, the air was thick with the biting cold, and the ground had already started to harden beneath the weight of the frost. The land had begun to settle into its grim frozen routine, and there would be no escaping it until the spring thaw, if it came. But Samuel wasn't concerned about the coming cold. He was concerned about the ferocity of it. The wind, sharp as a knife, began to howl through the trees, and the temperature plummeted lower than anyone had expected. The cold, biting, and relentless crept into every corner of the cabin, no matter how tight the seams between the logs. Samuel sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, but the heat didn't seem to reach him. He could feel it, the ever-encroaching frost that seemed to reach from the outside world, gnawing at his resolve. The second wall was still unfinished, but it was already providing a sense of security. Every log he placed, every inch he added to the structure was a small victory in the war against the elements. Night after night, the temperatures dropped until they reached a chilling -30. But Samuel's cabin remained warmer than any of the others. He didn't know it yet, but this would be the first test of the second wall. This would be the moment when he would understand exactly how much it had truly changed his survival odds. When he awoke the next morning, the snow outside had reached a height of nearly a foot, and the wind was only picking up speed. The fire had burned down to embers, and Samuel knew that his cabin had already been tested. The wind was relentless, howling in gusts so strong that the cabin seemed to sway, but still the structure held. With each passing hour, the temperatures continued to fall. Samuel stoked the fire again, feeling the warmth seeping back into the room. He stepped outside to check the second wall's resilience against the storm. The wind cut through the open air like a blade, but the additional layer of logs held firm. He stood there, hands frozen but still clenched tight around the axe, staring at the wall as the storm raged around him. In the distance, the neighbor's cabin bare, vulnerable to the howling winds, looked so fragile, so exposed. Samuel could already see the smoke from their chimney dissipating into the wind. It wouldn't be long before the cold began to take hold, inching its way through the cracks in the walls and floors. But not his cabin. Not anymore. The second wall wasn't just an idea anymore. It was proof that, in this world, when you build with enough determination, you can bend nature to your will. For days, Samuel worked in silence, his mind consumed by a single idea. The second wall had started as an oddity, something people mocked, as an unnecessary extravagance. But for Samuel, it had become something far more significant. Each log he placed, each knot he meticulously secured, was another step in a project that had consumed him since the day he first saw the weakness in the walls of his cabin. His neighbors had long since abandoned their snickers, more concerned with surviving the encroaching winter than with the man building a fortress around his humble home. It was strange to them, that need for excess. But Samuel had stopped explaining himself. Their laughter didn't bother him anymore. In fact, he was beginning to realize that it was no longer about them. It was about him and the wilderness, about the battle he was waging against something far larger than himself. The cold outside was unforgiving, but within the walls of his cabin there was a comfort he hadn't known before. He still felt the bitter sting of the wind every time he stepped outside, but when he returned to his haven, the difference was undeniable. The second wall wasn't just an obstacle to the cold. It had become an anchor, a psychological one, a way of creating order amidst the chaos of nature's relentless assault. He couldn't explain it fully. There was no logical reasoning to the obsessive hours he'd spent on it. Maybe it was the memories of men he'd known, ones who hadn't made it through these storms. Or perhaps it was the unbearable grief of loss, a need to control something in a world so wild and uncontrollable. Whatever it was, Samuel knew that his future depended on this wall, on this act of defiance against the very forces that had broken so many before him. At night, he would sit in front of the fire, staring into the flames, thinking of what lay beyond the safety of his cabin. The danger was always out there, raging storms, hungry predators, and the ever-present threat of isolation. But in the quiet, while the storm outside roared like a beast, Samuel knew something the others didn't. His obsession was more than a wall. It was a declaration that he could survive, that he could fight back. When he stepped outside in the morning, the wind had only grown colder. But for the first time, Samuel felt an unshakable sense of calm. He was ready. The second wall might not stop the storm entirely, but it would make him ready to face it head-on. The first true cold snap of the season arrived without warning, and it took no mercy. By the time the first frost appeared on the window panes, the temperature had already dipped below zero, and the wind seemed to carry with it the very breath of winter itself. Samuel had felt the warning signs for days. The air had grown thinner, the winds fiercer, but nothing prepared him for the brutal reality of what lay ahead. He stood at the door of his cabin, watching as the storm swept across the land like a tidal wave, consuming everything in its path. The sky had gone an ominous shade of gray, and the wind had a howling quality to it, as though nature itself was screaming in frustration. The trees bent under the pressure of the wind, their bare branches rattling against each other. But inside, Samuel stood firm. His cabin, his fortress, was different now. The second wall was more than just a shield against the cold. It was the difference between life and death. He could feel it in his bones. Every gust of wind that hit the outer logs was absorbed by the double barrier. Inside, where the fire crackled softly in the hearth, there was a subtle warmth that pushed against the icy grip of winter, trying to creep inside. The cold seemed to wrap itself around the world, squeezing out any warmth, any hope of comfort. Samuel's breath fogged the air as he exhaled, but inside the cabin he barely noticed. The second wall had already done its job. The draft he had once felt on his neck as he sat by the fire was gone, replaced with a stillness that was almost unsettling in its quiet security. The wind outside reached a howling crescendo, rattling the windows and slamming against the thick logs of the second wall. Samuel could hear the subtle creaks of the wood as the storm pressed against it, but it held firm. Every log, every layer of protection, every minute spent building it now, it was all coming to fruition. He walked across the cabin, carefully measuring the warmth inside by the flickering light of the fire. His hands, raw and tired from months of hard labor, almost didn't notice the cold anymore. Instead, he felt the comfort of the heat from the fire on his face, the small, almost imperceptible heat that had never been there before. As he stared out the small window, he knew that the worst was still to come. The storm would only grow worse before it relented. But now, more than ever, he felt an odd peace. There was nothing he could do to stop the storm. But with his cabin, with his second wall, he had done everything he could to survive it. And in this world, in this unforgiving wilderness, that was all that mattered. For the first time, Samuel let himself smile. The wind howled relentlessly, a constant companion to the solitude that Samuel had come to know so well. But it wasn't just the cold that kept him on edge, it was the unseen threats that always lingered in the wilderness, waiting for their moment to strike. Samuel had long known that the mountain was full of dangers, both seen and unseen. Wolves roamed the forests, their eyes glinting with hunger, while bears prowled the land in search of food. Yet, there was one threat that Samuel couldn't see: the ones that hunted at night, silent and patient, the ones that had no respect for human life. It wasn't until one particular evening, when the air grew particularly sharp and the first signs of snow began to fall, that Samuel truly felt the weight of these threats pressing down on him. As he stepped outside to check the condition of the second wall, the crunch of his boots on the snow sounded unnervingly loud. A figure in the distance caught his eye, a massive, hunched shape moving through the shadows at the edge of the trees. His hand instinctively reached for the rifle by his side, but the shape was gone before he could draw it. A shiver ran down his spine, but he wasn't sure whether it was from the cold or the sense of danger that had suddenly settled over him. He knew better than to dismiss his instincts. There was something in the air that night, something more than the biting cold and the falling snow. The land had a way of whispering its warnings, and Samuel had learned to listen. His eyes scanned the darkness, trying to catch a glimpse of the shape once more. But there was nothing. Turning back to the cabin, he closed the door behind him, sealing himself inside. He wasn't sure what he had seen, but the feeling lingered. Something was out there, watching, waiting. And as he sat by the fire, the warmth no longer felt quite as comforting. He couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter how solid the second wall was, it wouldn't stop the things he couldn't see. The next few days passed quietly, the storm intensifying as the snow continued to fall. Samuel was more cautious now, keeping a watchful eye on the woods around his cabin. He had built the second wall to keep the cold at bay, but there were far more dangerous forces in the wilderness forces that could not be kept out by mere logs. That night, as he lay in his bed, he heard it again, the unmistakable sound of something large moving outside. His heart raced, and his breath caught in his throat. He knew it wasn't the wind this time. Something was testing the boundaries of his fortress. Days bled into weeks as the storm raged on, turning the world outside into an unrecognizable blur of white. The temperature dipped even further, reaching a terrifying -35. The cold seemed to seep into every crevice of the land, turning everything it touched to ice. Yet, inside his cabin, Samuel felt the difference. The second wall had done more than provide shelter from the wind. It had transformed his home into something almost impenetrable, something far more solid and reliable than he had ever dreamed. But as the storm continued, Samuel began to realize something. Despite the fortress he had created, despite the protection of his second wall, he was still utterly alone. The isolation weighed on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had always known the wilderness was a solitary place, but now, with the storm isolating him from the rest of the world, it felt like the wilderness was swallowing him whole. He had heard the stories from the other trappers, the tales of survival, of men who had fought the elements and come out victorious. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the stories were never about the weather. They were about something deeper, something more primal, the constant struggle to remain human when the world around you demanded you become something else. It wasn't just the animals or the cold that made the wilderness so dangerous. It was the loneliness, the silence, the way it could chip away at your mind day after day until you were nothing more than a shadow of the man you had once been. Samuel had always been self-reliant, but there were times, like tonight, when he couldn't help but feel the weight of his isolation. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it couldn't chase away the emptiness that seemed to stretch endlessly around him. He stood by the window, staring out into the swirling snow, watching as the storm swallowed the world whole. For a moment, he felt small, insignificant, just one man against the wilderness, against the forces of nature that cared nothing for his struggle. But then, as he turned away from the window and returned to his fire, Samuel found strength in the knowledge that the second wall wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a reminder of his resilience, of his determination to survive in a world that would just as soon see him fail. He wasn't alone. He had built something that would protect him, something that would see him through the worst of the storm. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. Samuel's hands ached from days of work, the rough bark of the logs scraping against his skin as he added the final touches to the second wall. The cold seemed to seep into his bones, but he didn't mind. He had grown accustomed to it by now. What mattered was the wall, the layer of protection that stood between him and the wilderness, a sanctuary forged from his obsession and sheer willpower. It was late in the afternoon when he finished the last of the construction. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, Samuel felt a sense of satisfaction that only the completion of such an endeavor could bring. The second wall stood firm, its logs layered thick and secure, a formidable barrier that would protect him from the elements and any threat the wilderness might throw his way. He stepped back, wiping the sweat from his brow despite the chill in the air. The cabin had never felt more secure. The second wall, though unconventional and scoffed at by his neighbors, had proven its worth. It was more than just a physical barrier. It was a testament to his resolve, to the understanding that survival wasn't just about brute strength or fighting off every challenge. It was about preparation, about creating a defense that could withstand the most unforgiving forces. As Samuel turned to enter the cabin, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. He knew he had made the right decision in building the wall. The long hours, the sacrifice of comfort, the ridicule of his neighbors, all of it had led to this moment, where he stood on the threshold of his home, secure against the storm that would not relent. Inside, the fire crackled merrily, the flames casting long shadows against the walls. Samuel stepped closer, savoring the warmth. He felt the first true sense of peace since the storm had begun. His cabin wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a fortress. And for the first time in weeks, Samuel allowed himself to rest. But even as he settled into the warmth, he knew this wasn't the end. The storm was still raging outside, and though his walls had held firm, the true test was yet to come. The second wall had proven its value in theory, but its real strength would only be tested by the storm's unrelenting fury. Still, he felt a quiet confidence settle in his chest. He had done everything he could. Now he would wait. The night arrived swiftly, carrying with it an eerie stillness that made Samuel's skin prickle. The wind had died down somewhat, but the temperature continued to plummet, and the snow fell in thick, swirling sheets. The cabin, though sturdy, seemed to creak and groan as the storm pushed against it with relentless force. Inside, the fire burned low, and Samuel sat in his chair by the hearth, eyes narrowed, listening intently. The silence outside was unnerving. The storm had a way of muting the world, turning it into a vast, desolate nothingness. But it wasn't the storm that held Samuel's attention tonight. It was the sense that something else was out there, something waiting. He'd heard it earlier in the day, a low, rumbling growl carried on the wind. It was a sound he knew all too well, a bear. And not just any bear, but the kind that stalked its prey with a slow, calculating patience. Samuel's instincts screamed at him, a primal warning that he could not ignore. He rose from his chair, careful not to disturb the quiet. His rifle was within reach, but he knew he wouldn't need it just yet. What he needed was silence. What he needed was to listen. The crunch of snow outside was faint at first, barely noticeable, but then it grew louder. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as he stood motionless, waiting. He could hear it now, the unmistakable sound of heavy paws pressing into the snow, drawing closer and closer. The bear was out there, just beyond the reach of his firelight, testing the boundaries of his home. His grip tightened around the rifle. He was ready. But the real question was whether the second wall would hold. Would it be enough to keep the beast at bay, or would it be a fleeting hope shattered by nature's brutality? Samuel moved slowly, silently, to the narrow gun ports he had built into the cabin's walls. He peered through one of them, straining his eyes against the darkness. And then, there it was. The massive shape of the bear, its dark fur glistening with frost, moving closer to the cabin. Its eyes gleamed in the low light, filled with hunger. The bear paused, its breath visible in the cold air, and Samuel could see it test the ground around the cabin, sniffing the air. It wasn't just searching for food, it was looking for an opening. Samuel knew this instinctively. The second wall had held up against the storm, but would it withstand the force of a grizzly's assault? Minutes stretched into eternity as the bear circled the cabin, its low growls sending a shiver through Samuel's spine. His rifle remained poised in his hands, but he didn't fire. Not yet. Not until he was sure. The bear tested the door first, pushing against it with its massive weight. The logs groaned under the pressure, but they didn't give. The second wall had held firm. Samuel allowed himself a quiet breath of relief, but he didn't lower his guard. The night was far from over. The bear moved on, inspecting the corners of the cabin, then testing the window. Its claws scraped against the logs as it climbed, but there was no give. The bear was strong, persistent, but it would not find a weakness. Not tonight. And so, the standoff continued, with Samuel standing in the quiet shadows of his cabin, knowing that the second wall had done its job. He wasn't safe yet, but he was ready. And in the wilderness, that was all that mattered. The bear's heavy footsteps outside were relentless, its powerful presence pressing in on the cabin like an invisible force. Samuel stood still, watching through the narrow gunport, waiting for the right moment to act. The bear had circled the cabin several times now, testing the walls, the door, the window. It had tried every possible way in, but so far the second wall had held. The tension in the air was palpable. Samuel could feel it in his bones, the primal instinct to survive, to remain hidden, to stay as still and quiet as possible. The bear was smart. It wasn't just attacking the cabin blindly. It was testing, probing, looking for weaknesses, just as Samuel had hoped it would. The storm had subsided slightly, but the cold still gripped the landscape, wrapping everything in a frozen blanket. The fire inside the cabin flickered low, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Samuel hadn't dared to stoke it higher, not with the bear so close. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. His breath was shallow, quiet, careful. For a few moments, everything was still. The bear had stopped its inspection, and Samuel held his breath, straining his ears to listen. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees, but even the roar of the storm couldn't mask the silence that filled the space around him. And then, the bear moved again. It wasn't just the bear's movements that made Samuel's heart race. It was the way the creature seemed to understand the cabin. It wasn't just searching for food, it was methodically testing each weak point, looking for any possible way inside. But it wouldn't find one. Not here. The second wall, despite its unconventional design, had proven itself. Where other cabins had failed, where the cold had seeped in through cracks and gaps, this one remained steadfast. It was more than just a physical barrier, it was a testament to Samuel's obsession, to his refusal to accept anything less than survival. As the bear prowled around the cabin's perimeter, Samuel felt a surge of pride, albeit quiet and cautious. The second wall, the barrier that had seemed so absurd to everyone else, was now his lifeline. It had withstood the force of a grizzly, something no ordinary cabin could claim. But Samuel knew that he couldn't let his guard down. The bear was still out there, still circling, still testing. And he couldn't afford to take any chances. Not yet. Minutes turned into hours, and the tension in the air was suffocating. Samuel stayed frozen in place, barely daring to move. The bear's growls echoed through the night, and the sound of its claws scraping against the logs sent shivers down his spine. The storm had passed, but the true test of survival was just beginning. Samuel's heart raced, knowing that the wall had held for now. But how long could it hold against the might of a hungry grizzly? How long could he wait before the inevitable happened? Morning came, but the cold never relented. It was a sharp, unforgiving chill that wrapped itself around everything, even the heart of the mountain. The snow had slowed to a steady fall, dusting the ground with a layer of white that seemed to hide the world's edges, turning everything into a blur of gray and white. Samuel stood at the window, his breath fogging the glass, as he watched the storm's aftermath. His cabin, the fortress he had worked so tirelessly to build, was still standing strong, the second wall proving itself once more as the storm's rage had passed. But despite the calm, Samuel couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. The bear was still out there. It had left in the night, but he knew it would be back. The wilderness didn't let go so easily. He checked the door and window once more, running his hands over the logs, ensuring that everything was secure. The fire had burned down to embers, and the warmth inside the cabin felt more like a distant memory than a comfort. He couldn't forget what he had felt the night before, the pounding of his heart, the cold sweat on his skin as he had waited for the bear to find a way in. Samuel's eyes wandered to the second wall, the one that had kept him safe. He knew it wasn't just the wall that had saved him. It was his awareness, his readiness. He had built this cabin with more than just logs and nails. He had built it with his experience, his understanding of the wilderness, and his will to survive. The wall was only part of the equation. The rest came from the mind, from knowing the land, knowing its dangers, and being prepared for them. The second wall, though seemingly unimportant to those who mocked it, had been the difference between life and death. It wasn't just about the bear. It was about the constant threat that hung over him in this harsh, unforgiving environment. It was about knowing that, no matter how strong you were, no matter how determined, the wilderness could break you if you weren't careful. As he sat down at the table, his fingers numb from the cold, Samuel knew that the storm was far from over. The bear might have moved on, but other dangers waited silent, unseen, relentless. And so, he waited. For the cold to pass, for the bear to return, for the next test to come. But deep down, Samuel knew that as long as the second wall stood strong, he was ready. Ready for whatever the wilderness would throw his way. The first days after the storm passed were filled with silence, the kind of quiet that only comes after a violent confrontation with nature. The air felt thinner, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for the next phase of the battle to begin. Samuel stepped outside, his boots crunching in the snow as he surveyed the land around his cabin. The second wall had held firm during the storm's fury, but the real test was still to come. He had no illusions. The wilderness was relentless. If a grizzly hadn't breached his fortress before, there would be other dangers, predators, weather, or even the ravages of time. As he walked around the cabin, Samuel paused to inspect the structure. His hands ran over the logs, feeling the weight of each one, the sturdy foundation that had cost him days, weeks of labor. There was no doubt in his mind now that the second wall had been worth every hour, every ounce of energy spent on it. He had always known the wilderness would try to break him. It had taken his partner years ago, in an attack so brutal that the memory still haunted him. It had taken the lives of many others. In a place like this, survival wasn't a given. It was earned, and it was fragile. The second wall wasn't just about fighting back the cold. It was about fighting back the inevitability of death that hung over every trapper in the mountains. The cabin, the wall, they were a defiance against that fate. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees, but the logs of the second wall stood strong. The door, reinforced with iron brackets, remained unyielding. The window shutters, crafted with the same care, had survived the storm, their sturdy design untouched by the fierce winds. Still, Samuel couldn't help but wonder how long it would all hold. The cold would never fully relent. The grizzly would return, and he knew better than to expect a second chance if the bear managed to find a weakness. His heart pounded with the quiet pressure of that unspoken reality. There was no room for error. Not here. He continued his inspection of the cabin's outer walls, checking for gaps, cracks, any signs of stress. His fingers traced the tight seams where the logs met, ensuring that the chinking was intact. The mixture of clay, horsehair, and pine resin had dried solid, and the gaps between the logs were sealed tight. It would take more than a storm to crack the walls now. The second wall had been tested by the storm and had proven itself. It would stand against much more. But Samuel knew better than to get complacent. The wilderness was full of hidden dangers. A crack in the wall could mean death in the harshest of winters. And with the temperatures still dangerously low, he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not now. Not ever. As the days passed and the wind continued to howl outside, Samuel found himself growing weary in ways he hadn't expected. The physical exhaustion of building the cabin, the emotional weight of isolation, and the constant vigilance required to survive in such a harsh environment had begun to wear on him. He had never been one to doubt his decisions. He had spent years in the wilderness, facing every challenge head-on, but something about the solitude, the relentless cold, and the constant strain of surviving seemed to be chipping away at his resolve. One night, as the wind whistled through the trees and the snow piled up against the door, Samuel sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The heat from the fire barely touched him, the chill in the room more pervasive than the warmth from the hearth. He could feel it, an overwhelming sense of emptiness, of something missing. The walls of his cabin, the second wall that had given him so much confidence, now felt like a cage. Had he built it to protect himself, or had he built it to hide from the fear that constantly gnawed at him? The wilderness was unforgiving, yes, but was the threat of it enough to justify the distance he had created between himself and the outside world? Samuel stood up, pacing the room as doubt crept in. He had become consumed by the need to survive, to control what he could in a world that seemed to constantly test his limits. But at what cost? He had seen others die in these mountains, men who had been unprepared, who had been too confident in their ability to endure. And yet, he wondered if his own obsession with survival had made him just as fragile, just as vulnerable as the men who had failed before him. Was his fortress a true safeguard, or had it become a prison of his own making? The storm had passed, and the cold had settled into an unyielding presence. But despite the peace he had found inside the walls, the outside world still loomed large. The wilderness was never quiet for long, and Samuel knew deep down that the second wall, no matter how strong, couldn't protect him from the toll isolation and self-doubt could take on a man. He couldn't afford to question his decisions now, not when the stakes were so high. But as he sat back down by the fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows across the room, Samuel wondered if the walls he had built were just as much a barrier to his own peace of mind as they were a shield from the world outside. Winter had been relentless, and though the storm had passed, the cold still clung to the land like a predator stalking its prey. The days seemed to stretch on endlessly, marked only by the ever-present wind and the occasional flurry of snow. Inside his cabin, Samuel had grown accustomed to the quiet isolation that surrounded him. The fire crackled steadily in the hearth, offering the only warmth in the otherwise frigid room. But despite the comfort, something inside him was stirring, a feeling that he could no longer ignore. The second wall had proven itself time and time again. It had stood firm against the howling winds, the brutal cold, and the hunger of a grizzly that had tried, and failed, to breach it. But now, As Samuel stared out the small window at the vast, snow-covered wilderness, he knew there was something more to the struggle than just surviving the cold. The storm had been a test, but what came next would be a different kind of battle. The wilderness wasn't just an enemy, it was a force that could strip you of everything, including the hope that survival was possible. And Samuel had learned that lesson the hard way. His obsession with building the perfect cabin, with creating a fortress that could withstand the unforgiving elements, had come at a price. It had cost him his peace of mind, his sense of connection to the world outside, and perhaps his humanity. He hadn't spoken to another person in months, and the weight of his solitude was beginning to take its toll. The second wall had kept him safe, but it had also kept him trapped in his own thoughts, trapped in a cycle of obsession and doubt that he couldn't escape. That morning, Samuel had woken early, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion that weighed heavily on his body. He had worked tirelessly on the cabin for so long, each task done with an intensity born of necessity. But now, with the second wall standing strong and the fire keeping the interior warm, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something more than just the feeling of safety, something beyond the survival instincts that had driven him to build this fortress in the first place. He stood by the window, looking out at the empty, snow-covered expanse that stretched out before him. The world seemed to go on forever, blanketed in white, quiet and still. And for the first time in a long while, Samuel realized just how isolated he had become. The wind had stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. The mountain was empty, just like him. It was a bitter realization, one that struck him deep in his chest. He had spent so much time fortifying himself against the dangers of the wilderness, against the cold, the animals, the storms, that he had forgotten what it meant to truly live. The realization hit him like a wave, crashing through the walls he had so carefully built around himself. Samuel knew that he couldn't keep living this way. The second wall had served its purpose, but it was no longer enough. To truly survive, he needed something more, something beyond the cold, beyond the walls. The question lingered in his mind. What did he need to do to break free from this cycle of survival, to reconnect with the world that had once felt so distant? The air outside had grown bitter once again, colder than it had been in days. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the cabin's walls as though trying to tear them down. Inside, the fire crackled and popped, casting shadows on the walls that flickered and danced. But despite the warmth of the hearth, Samuel felt the chill creeping back into his bones. The isolation that had once seemed like a comforting escape now felt more like a burden than a shield. The weight of his thoughts pressed heavily on him as he sat by the fire, his hands resting on the worn wooden arms of his chair. He had spent the better part of the day maintaining the cabin, checking the walls, ensuring that the second wall was still intact. But now, as the night deepened, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a restlessness inside him, a gnawing sense of unease that he couldn't ignore. He had spent so long focused on surviving, on keeping the dangers of the wilderness at bay, that he had forgotten something crucial. He had forgotten the importance of living, of experiencing life beyond mere existence. The wilderness had a way of wearing a man down, stripping away his purpose until all that remained was the will to survive. And that, Samuel realized, was not enough. It never had been. As the night stretched on, Samuel's thoughts drifted to the past, to the days before he had come to the mountain. He thought of the people he had known, his family, his friends, the other trappers who had shared stories around a campfire. He thought of the laughter, the camaraderie, the feeling of belonging. He thought of the warmth of human connection, something that had been missing from his life for so long. In the quiet of the cabin, surrounded by the protection of his second wall, Samuel realized that he had lost touch with the very thing that had once made survival worthwhile. It wasn't enough to just survive. He had to live, to share his experiences, to be part of something greater than himself. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the cabin, Samuel sat still, lost in his thoughts. His gaze wandered to the second wall, to the fortress he had built with his own hands. It had kept him safe. It had kept him alive. But it had also kept him trapped in a cycle of solitude, a cycle he no longer wanted to continue. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting a soft, flickering light across the room. Samuel sat in the quiet, the weight of his decision settling over him. Tomorrow, he would leave. He would face the wilderness, not as an adversary, but as a part of the world he had long since disconnected from. He would seek out others, reconnect with the people he had once known, and find a way to live once again. But for now, the storm raged outside, and Samuel allowed himself to rest, knowing that he had made his decision. The second wall had served its purpose, but it was time to break free. It was time to live. The night was long, longer than any night Samuel had endured in the wilderness before. The storm had begun again, fiercer than ever. The wind tore through the trees with a haunting howl, and the snow seemed to come at him from every direction, blinding, relentless, as though the world itself was closing in. Inside the cabin, Samuel sat by the fire, watching the flickering flames dance in the hearth. The warmth was a small comfort against the bone-chilling cold that had crept into the land once again. But even with the fire crackling beside him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The storm was one thing, but the air felt different tonight, darker, heavier. Outside, the howling winds raged against the cabin. They were fierce, the kind of storm that could break a man in half if he wasn't careful. But Samuel had survived storms before. This wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last. Still, tonight felt different. He could feel the tension building, the sense that the wilderness was about to test him in a way it never had before. His mind kept returning to the same thought. The second wall had stood strong through every storm, every attack from the wilderness. But would it stand up to the storm now? Would it be enough to protect him from the dangers lurking in the night? The bear had been a close call, and he knew it was only a matter of time before it or something else returned. The wilderness didn't forget easily. It was only a matter of time before it would seek to take what it had missed before. Samuel stood up, the floor creaking beneath his feet as he crossed the room to the window. The glass was frosted over, and he wiped it clean with his sleeve, peering outside. The snow fell in thick, swirling sheets, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. But he could hear it. Something was moving outside. Something large. His heart began to race. He grabbed his rifle, steadying his breath. He had prepared for this. The second wall had been built for moments like this, moments when the storm wasn't just nature's fury, but something more primal, something more dangerous. And tonight, the wilderness was testing him. His hand gripped the rifle's barrel, fingers tightening around the cold steel. He was ready. But the question remained, would the second wall be enough? Would it be enough to protect him against the bear, against whatever else the wilderness had in store? As the sound outside grew closer, the tension became unbearable. The walls of the cabin groaned under the force of the wind, and Samuel felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He couldn't afford to hesitate. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. The growl of the bear echoed through the storm, and Samuel's blood ran cold. The animal was close. He could feel its presence, heavy and ominous, just beyond the walls. His rifle was ready, but the second wall was his first line of defense. It had always been his first line of defense. He knew the bear would try again, and this time it would be relentless. The storm had made everything harder, but the wall had already stood firm against its fury. Would it hold against the power of a bear? Samuel wasn't sure, but he had no choice but to trust it now. The growl grew louder, closer, and with a burst of raw strength, the bear lunged at the cabin, slamming into the outer walls with a force that rattled the entire structure. Samuel staggered back, his heart pounding in his chest. The second wall groaned, but it held firm. For now, it was enough. The bear tested the door first, ramming into it with a deafening crash. The logs shook, but the iron brackets and the reinforced corners stood strong. Samuel's breath quickened as he positioned himself at the gun port, rifle aimed and steady. The bear roared again, its claws scraping against the wood, but it couldn't get through. For what felt like an eternity, the bear circled the cabin, testing every point of entry, every weakness. The storm outside had intensified, but inside the cabin, there was a strange sense of calm. The second wall had done its job, standing strong against the bear's attack. It had proven itself, again and again. Samuel's heart raced, but he didn't let the fear take hold. He couldn't afford to lose focus now. The bear wouldn't give up. It would keep coming. But the second wall had withstood its assault. And Samuel, though tired and worn, would hold his ground. Morning arrived slowly, the light creeping through the frost-covered window, casting pale rays across the cabin. Samuel hadn't slept. The night had been a blur of tension, the storm raging on outside and the bear circling his cabin, trying to break through. But through it all, the second wall had held strong. He had emerged victorious, not through strength, but through patience, preparation, and an understanding of what the wilderness demanded. Samuel stood by the window, his eyes scanning the landscape beyond the cabin. The storm had passed, but the cold was still biting, still oppressive. The snow was deep, the world outside a sea of white. But inside, it was different. He had won the battle. The second wall had proven itself. Yet, as Samuel gazed at the untouched landscape, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in him. The storm, the bear, the isolation, it had all brought him to this moment, to this realization. The second wall wasn't just a physical barrier. It was more than just protection from the elements or the dangers of the wilderness. It was a symbol of his struggle, his resilience, and his refusal to give in. But now, as he looked out at the still empty world, he understood something deeper. The second wall had kept him alive, but it had also kept him isolated. It had been a shield, but it had also been a prison. Samuel had built it to protect himself, but in doing so, he had built walls around himself that went beyond the physical. He had isolated himself from the world, from the very thing that had once made life meaningful connection. The realization hit him with the force of the storm that had raged outside. He had survived, yes, but at what cost? The wilderness had taught him many lessons, but perhaps the greatest lesson was this: survival wasn't enough. To truly live, he needed to break down the walls he had built around his heart. Samuel stood there for a long time, looking out at the mountains, the vastness of the land stretching before him. The second wall had kept him safe, but it was time to leave it behind. Time to reconnect with the world he had forgotten. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, Samuel felt the weight of his decision. It was time to move on, to leave the fortress he had built and return to the world. The storm was over, and it was time to face whatever came next, unprotected but free. The snow had settled, and the winds had died down. Samuel stood outside his cabin, taking one last look at the structure that had been his fortress for so long. The second wall, though it had proven its worth, no longer felt like a symbol of protection. It had become a reminder of everything he had shut out: his fears, his isolation, and the walls he had built around his heart. The wilderness had tested him, and in return, he had built a fortress. But the truth had become undeniable. Survival wasn't enough. He had survived the storms, the bears, the cold. But now, as he prepared to leave the mountain behind, he realized that it had been the isolation, not the wilderness itself, that had been the true challenge. He packed only what he needed: his rifle, a few supplies, and a small bundle of furs. Everything else would stay behind, including the cabin that had once been his lifeline. There was no sense in clinging to a place that had kept him locked away from the world. It was time to move on, to return to town, and reconnect with the people he had left behind. The journey down the mountain was slow and deliberate, the snow crunching beneath his boots as he made his way toward the small settlement that had once been his home. The path was familiar, but it felt different now. The isolation of the past months had changed him, and as he descended into the valley, he couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and trepidation. What would it be like to see others again, to be part of something beyond himself? By the time Samuel reached the town, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the snow-covered streets. The small, weather-beaten houses seemed quieter than he remembered, their chimneys puffing thin trails of smoke into the evening sky. He paused at the edge of town, taking in the sight of the place he had once called home. It looked the same, but to him, it felt different. As he walked through the main street, the familiar sights and sounds of the town greeted him. He could hear the low hum of conversation from inside the local tavern, the soft clink of a horseshoe against stone as someone worked at the forge. But it wasn't the town that felt unfamiliar, it was him. He had spent so much time in the wilderness, building walls around himself, that he wasn't sure how to break through those walls now. Samuel entered the tavern, the warm air hitting him like a wave as he stepped inside. The conversation stopped for a moment as everyone turned to look at him, but Samuel didn't mind. He had expected the stares, the questions, the curiosity. But it wasn't the attention that mattered, it was the connection, the shared experience that he had been missing for so long. "Samuel," someone called from across the room. It was old Bill, a trapper he had known years ago. "Well, I'll be damned. Look at you. You're back." Samuel smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. He hadn't realized how much he had missed the simple act of conversation, of being in the presence of others. He walked over to Bill, feeling the weight of the years lift as he sat down across from him. "You've been gone a long time," Bill said, eyeing him curiously. "Thought you were lost to the mountain." "I was," Samuel replied quietly, his voice reflecting a truth he hadn't spoken aloud in a long time. "But I'm not anymore." The words hung between them, and for a moment, Samuel didn't know what to say next. He had spent so much time in solitude, so much time preparing for survival, that he had forgotten how to simply be. But as Bill poured him a drink, and the sounds of the tavern filled the air once more, Samuel realized something important. Survival had never been about walls or isolation. It was about living, about sharing life with others, about being part of something greater than himself. The evening passed with laughter, stories, and the warmth of human connection. Samuel didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't need them. He had found what he was looking for, not in the second wall, but in the people around him. Days turned into weeks, and life in the town began to feel like a new chapter for Samuel. He found work again, not as a trapper, but in the small wood shop near the edge of town, helping to repair homes and make furniture for the settlers. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was work that brought him back to life, one small step at a time. As he walked through the town, he couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in himself. His once solitary existence had given way to a new sense of purpose, a new understanding of what it meant to truly live. He had spent so much time building walls to protect himself from the wilderness, but now he understood that the true strength came from breaking those walls down, from reaching out and connecting with the world, no matter how unpredictable or harsh it might be. The cabin on the mountain, with its second wall, was gone now. It had served its purpose, but it was no longer a symbol of survival. It was a relic of a past that Samuel had left behind. He had let go of the physical walls, but he had also let go of the emotional walls that had kept him trapped in the cycle of fear and isolation. One day, as Samuel stood by the river, watching the water flow steadily past, he realized that the true test had never been about surviving the wilderness. It had always been about learning to live in it, learning to find balance between survival and connection, between strength and vulnerability. The legacy of the second wall was not just in its physical strength, but in what it had taught him. It had shown him that survival was only one part of the equation. To truly live, he had to face his fears, embrace the unknown, and reach out to others. As the sun set over the mountains, casting a golden glow across the sky, Samuel felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The wilderness, with all its dangers and beauty, was no longer something to be feared. It was a part of him, and he was a part of it. And in that moment, he knew that the real journey was just beginning. The second wall had been the first step. Now, it was time to move forward, to live fully, to build a new kind of strength, one that was rooted not in isolation, but in connection. And with that, Samuel stepped forward into a new life, knowing that no wall, no matter how strong, could ever keep him from what mattered most.